Investigating the president, Democrats subpoena the acting White House Chief of Staff, Mick Mulvaney. We have the latest in the impeachment probe. Ready to run? A report says a former mayor of New York City might be launching a presidential campaign. Gathering of bishops, a preview of the American bishops meeting next week in Baltimore. And the Virgin of the Rocks, an exhibit in London, displays a painting by Leonardo da Vinci as it hasn't been seen in centuries. On EWTN News Nightly for Friday, November 8th, 2019. Good evening from Washington. Thanks for joining us for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm ytsync-en. President Donald Trump says the testimony in the impeachment investigation has not damaged him. Witnesses have talked about the president urging Ukraine to investigate his political rivals. White House correspondent Mark Irons joins us with that story. Mark?
Jason, the president says he is not concerned about anything that has been disclosed thus far in the impeachment inquiry. Democrats have been releasing transcripts of closed-door testimonies as we are now just days away from public hearings.
Well, they shouldn't be having public hearings. This is a hoax. This is just like the Russian witch hunt. This is just a continuation.
The impeachment probe over the president's dealings with Ukraine will soon enter a new phase. The public hearings will shed light on the witnesses who already testified behind closed doors.
I'm not concerned about anything. The testimony has all been fine. I mean, for the most part, I never even heard of these people. I have no idea who they are.
Newly released testimony from State Department official George Kent says President Trump wanted to hear 3 words from the president of Ukraine during a July phone call: investigations, Biden, and Clinton. Kent claims his testimony is based on contact with other officials who had more direct contact with President Trump.
It seems that nobody has any first-hand knowledge. There is no first-hand knowledge.
President Trump denies there is any quid pro quo, a withholding of U.S. military aid to Ukraine, unless it investigated his political rivals.
And all you have to do is take a look at Biden, and you'll see tremendous corruption, because what he did is quid pro quo times 10.
The president says the transcript of his July phone call with the president of Ukraine clears his name. Democrats say it proves he sought a foreign country's assistance for his own political gain.
The evidence is overwhelming and uncontradicted at this point. It's very clear exactly what the president was doing at that point.
As expected, acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney failed to appear on Capitol Hill today to testify. And yesterday, former National Security Advisor John Bolton also failed to appear for his deposition. Democrats say these no-shows are evidence of the president's obstruction of Congress. Jason.
Okay, White House correspondent Mark Irons. Thanks, Mark. And joining us now to talk about all this is John Gizzi, chief political columnist and White House correspondent for Newsmax. Great to have you back on.
Great to be here.
So Republicans have been asking for transparency, but now next week they're going to have these open hearings. President Trump calls them a bad idea. Why the mixed messaging here?
Well, I have to say that the hearings behind closed doors rely totally on reports and things that are carried in the Fourth Estate about it. With the hearings televised and being able to be seen by the public, they will be able to judge for themselves. And I think you will see a major shift in the polling numbers depending on the performance of the witnesses. In other words, names such as Sondland and Kent and others that we have heard at this point, Taylor, are now going to have faces put on them, not to mention Colonel Vindman.
So Taylor, you mentioned him. He's first up. He's the head of the embassy right now, the American embassy in Ukraine. He's going to be the first one up on Wednesday, and Democrats wanted him to go first because they're hoping he'll give some explosive testimony in front of these cameras on Wednesday.
Taylor has always been labeled the star witness in all things Ukraine. Even before his face and name became known, people were telling me, who know the diplomatic circuit well, watch for Bill Taylor. We will see if he lives up to the advance notices.
We'll see what happens. And Republicans are aiming, they're equipping their team now with the Intelligence Committee. They're adding Jim Jordan, who's a fighter, an attack dog. What's the significance of adding him to the Intelligence Committee, replacing a younger freshman or a younger member of the committee?
Well, I think you said it accurately. Jim Jordan is a fighter, I noticed after covering him since he was a freshman congressman, I have yet to see him wear a jacket at all. He's still the wrestling coach and stripped down and ready for combat all the time. I think the very fact that so many reports in the media tried to undercut him personally, and yet he wins back home quite easily, shows just what kind of a person he is. He's the untethered attack animal for Republicans.
We'll see what happens in those open hearings next week. One last point, the Senate confirmed this week the 45th appeals court judge for President Donald Trump. I mean, what does this mean for the nation moving forward?
Well, as you know, the White House had a virtual celebration of that. I think it's significant because one can say, while there have been changes in the size of the third branch of government, the judiciary, in the last 80 years, this president, who's only been in one term, has had as much impact on the judiciary as Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was in for 12 years in the White House. And he has named 2 Supreme Court justices, as you say, 45 members of the Court of Appeals and the District Court. And what this means, very simply, is that younger judges who are clearly vetted to be constructionists, that is, interpreting the Constitution rather than amending it in their own ways, are going to be on the bench for a long, long time. Most of the Trump appointees replace appointees of Democratic President Bill Clinton, who are nearing the retirement age. This pattern will certainly continue and be enhanced if this president gets a second term.
We'll see. We got one big year ahead of us, that's for sure. John Gizzi, chief political columnist and White House correspondent for Newsmax. Thanks for being with us today.
Always a pleasure.
John. And another person thinks about running for president, and it could be a big shakeup for the Democratic race. That's Michael Bloomberg, the billionaire former mayor of New York City. Bloomberg moves to get on the primary ballot in Alabama. That state's filing deadline is today. An advisor says Bloomberg is growing more worried, thinking the current crop of Democrats might not be able to beat President Trump. And Jeff Sessions wants his Senate seat back, so the former Attorney General jumps into the Alabama race. Sessions served in the Senate for 20 years, from 1997 to 2017. Then he worked as President Trump's first Attorney General. Democrat Doug Jones won the seat in a special election. Jones is the most vulnerable Senate Democrat facing re-election next year. A judge strikes down protections for pro-life medical workers. The Trump administration rule would allow people to refuse to take part in care if it violates their religion or their moral beliefs. A federal judge in Washington state blocked that Trump rule. The decision is similar to one in New York this week. Tougher security in Chile isn't stopping protesters. The protests started 3 weeks ago. They want change, including better education and health care. At least 20 people have been killed. Now to Hong Kong, where a student protester has died. Alex Chow fell off a parking garage. It came after police fired tear gas at protesters. The death fuels even more anger.
We need to know and seek for truth and justice, and which is really insane and unreasonable for how the government allowed the police attempt to murder Hong Kong people, which prove that reform the police force is a must.
Joshua Wong and other protest leaders want an independent investigation into police brutality. There's Pope Francis meeting the president of Lithuania. The Baltic states' leader thanked the Holy Father for praying for the country. Last year, Pope Francis visited Lithuania. Coming up, a look at the main items on the agenda of next week's meeting of the U.S. bishops. A judge throws out a case that alleged a Catholic diocese knowingly hired sex abusers. The judge is looking for the state's Supreme Court to decide if the case violates the separation of church and state. West Virginia's Attorney General filed this lawsuit. And bishops from around the country will soon meet in Baltimore. the main order of business, electing their new president and vice president. The bishops also will elect 6 committee chairs. Archbishop Jose Gomez of Los Angeles is the current vice president, and that means he's likely to be promoted to president. Joining us now with a preview is Matt Hadro, senior correspondent at Catholic News Agency. Matt, welcome back to the show.
Good to be on. Thanks for having me.
So tell us about Archbishop Gomez. Is he considered, will he be elected to be president?
Yes, the bishops normally, in electing their leadership, choose the vice president to become the next president of the conference. So it's expected that Archbishop Gomez will be the next president of the conference for a 3-year term.
And what kind of president do you think he might be?
So he's been the vice president for the last 3 years. He's oversees the largest diocese in the country, a very diverse diocese. He, if elected, would be the first immigrant president. He's also a member of Opus Dei. He, I think, would particularly carry on. There was a national meeting of Hispanic Catholic leadership last year, the 5th Encuentro, and that'll actually be one of the items that's going to be discussed in the fall meetings in Baltimore, is kind of taking everything that was gathered from that meeting and really putting it, trying to put it into practice at the parish level. And so I think, in particular, evangelization of in the future of the Hispanic Catholic Church in the U.S. Would be very interesting to watch under his watch as president.
So one of the most interesting things to watch really is going to be these vice presidential election, because there's a whole slew of candidates for that. Tell us about some of them.
Sure. So, you have Archbishop Timothy Broglio from the Archdiocese of Military Services. You have Bishop Frank Caggiano of Bridgeport, Connecticut. He was just over in Rome actually meeting with Pope Francis during the ad limina visit of the New England bishops. You have Bishop Jerome Listecki of Milwaukee. There's a really large, I think, around 9 or 10 candidates. From what I've been hearing, that Archbishop Broglio would be one of the front runners for the position.
And we'll have to see who they actually pick, because like you said, there's a whole number of them and just a lot of issues that they're going to be talking about. There's also going to be voting on committee chairs. There's a lot of committees that the U.S. bishops have. What are some of the notable committee chairs up for a vote this time?
So there will be 6 committee chairs in the elections total, and 3 of them in particular I would note. One would be the Religious Freedom Committee. That became a permanent committee only several years back, and as well as the Child Protection Committee, that will obviously be a very important one as the Church in the U.S. continues to respond to kind of the second round of clergy sex abuse from last year, and also the Committee on Evangelization, that whoever will be leading that committee will succeed Bishop Robert Barron in that regard.
And we know he spoke this last summer, talked about how do you reach out to the nuns. These are people that don't have any professed faith. They say they don't have a religious faith, a real challenge for evangelization right now.
Absolutely, and I've interviewed Bishop Barron over the summer, and he was very frank about that, and that's something that he's been talking about for a while, and that the many different studies, including Pew Research, have showed just a general decline in Christianity in the U.S., particularly amongst millennials, and even amongst Hispanic Catholics. It's no longer a majority are Catholic. The number has fallen 10% in the last decade.
And I know sex abuse has been on the minds of so many Catholics for the last year since all these revelations happened last year with McCarrick. Are they going to be talking about this again this November?
It's certainly anticipated to be part of the discussion. I'm sure a lot of Catholics in the U.S. will want it to be a part of the discussion, as well as the recent Amazon Synod. It'll be interesting to see, too, how the topic of synodality comes up. I would point to 2 examples. For instance, Bishop McElroy in San Diego has been calling for that, and he last year hosted listening sessions in his own diocese as a response to the abuse crisis. Bishop Hebda up in Minneapolis has been doing Archbishop Hebda in Minneapolis has been doing the same thing up there, hosting a synod over the summer and listening sessions this fall. So that'll be interesting to see how synodality might come up as a response to the abuse crisis in the U.S.
Okay, well, you and I will be listening to the bishops next week in Baltimore. Thanks so much. Matt Hadro, senior correspondent at Catholic News Agency. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Jason.
Up next, talking about end-of-life decisions from a Catholic perspective. And a Da Vinci painting is about to be displayed as if it were in a 16th century church. We'll explain. Think of all of the hard decisions that come up around the end of life. A new book tries to give answers, all from a Catholic perspective. It's called We Are the Lord's, a Catholic guide to difficult end-of-life questions. In it, Father Jeffrey Kirby helps the faithful handle death and the dying process. And Father Kirby joins us now. Welcome back. So why was it so important for you to write this book?
Well, I've been noticing that just pastorally, there are more and more questions about end of life. So we see there's an attack at the beginning of life. We've seen that now for several decades. And now there's this new attack, aggressive attack on the end of life. And people of faith are being asked, we're living longer, there's more technology in the West. And people are sincerely asking questions like, what am I supposed to do? What's the right thing to do? And so the book was written from a lot of that experience, some theological studies, and to provide a basic, very readable, very accessible help resource for people to understand the Church's teachings.
And I know at the beginning you say if you have pressing questions right now, turn to chapter 7. What are some of those pressing questions that they're going to look at here?
Two of the big ones is nutrition, hydration when it's artificially administered, and then the management of pain.
So we're talking about people that are on feeding tubes, for example?
Exactly, right, exactly. That's the big one because a lot of times hospice care and various hospitals and nurses and so on will say, once it goes artificial, then you can just stop it. We don't believe that. Like, if the body can still assimilate, it can still, take the food, then it has to be provided. Otherwise, you are depriving someone of a basic human need. So we have very clear teachings on that. So nutrition, hydration is a battleground, and then management of pain.
And then I know that the Church goes into extra, so you're talking about ordinary means, which is food and water, but what about these extraordinary means that the Church says, okay, there is some discernment there, right?
Yes, exactly, and that's chapter 6. So if you're in a hurry and there's something pressing, you're in an ICU, you're in an emergency room, go to chapter 7. But if you have time, go to chapter 6 because it spells out those principles of discernment, ordinary, extraordinary care. So very helpful.
Now, you are both a moral theologian. You answer questions on all kind of issues involving these tough, really tough, pressing issues across the country, and also a priest. So what's it like then putting both of those together?
I tell you, it's a great experience because I don't have the privilege of the abstract as some academics, and I don't have the privilege of simply being, ignorance is bliss in the trenches. So my world is very much combined, which I appreciate because I have this studies and this research that's being done, but yet I'm also a parish priest, so I'm getting called to the hospital and various things. So I appreciate that because it allows everything to become concrete. And I hope that anyone who looks at this book will see that it's very practical. It's from lived experience. It has a depth of wisdom and research and so on that comes from our tradition, but it's very practical.
We are in the month of November. We're praying for the dead. Catholics often visit cemeteries and pray for the dead at this point. What are the last thoughts right now on death and dying from a Catholic perspective?
Yes, I would say that we are children of the resurrection as believers, and we are to always hold that and not to be concerned about the passing things of this world, and instead to be focused on what the church's teachings are, how we're called to live, so that we can share in that resurrection. So.
Beautiful, beautiful hope of the resurrection awaits us. So we pray for that and we pray for our dead. Thank you so much, Father Kirby, for being with us today.
Appreciate it, yes.
Thank you. And Pope Francis leaves for Japan in less than 2 weeks. Now the Japanese church releases the theme song for the visit. The theme of Pope Francis's trip is Protect All Life. It refers to both human dignity and the environment. Our next guest was born in Japan and converted to Catholicism while living in Florence, Italy. Award-winning Japanese artist Osamu-Giovanni Micico joins us from Rome. Pope Francis will be the second pope to visit Japan. What are you hoping will come from his visit?
Well, I hope that his visit to Japan brings Japanese Christian and also non-Christian to see that the faith in the Catholic Church and that the history of Christianity in Japan is also alive until today.
And a country that's had great persecution of Christians in the past. Japan right now is less than about 1% Catholic. So what is it like practicing your faith in a predominantly Buddhist country?
The government prohibited Christianity so long, and also there are tendency to pass on what ancestors believed or thought. So there is a form of indifference to Christianity still remained in Japan, indifference to that they think it's not their thing, it's something outside. But from my experience of conversion, I can say that Christian faith is to everybody, also including Japanese people, of course. So I hope this the visit of the Pope Francis can give a new light to their spirit.
And I'd like to ask you a little bit more about your own personal conversion. What exactly led you, besides God's grace, obviously, but what led you to convert to Catholicism?
Well, I was studying a sacred art. Well, that was art to me. I was studying Renaissance and Baroque art without even knowing anything about Jesus Christ nor Bible. So the artistic interest led me to the sacred art first. But eventually I realized that was not just artistic interest. That was the mercy of God, that spirituality those paintings and sculpture represented, which attracted me. When I realized that, I started to look into Bible, and that's how my conversion started to take place.
Well, what a beautiful story. I know Pope Benedict spoke about how beauty was an apologetic leading people to the faith. Thank you so much for your time, Osamu-Giovanni Micico. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And finally tonight, a new exhibit features one of the most famous paintings of Renaissance master Leonardo da Vinci. It's called The Virgin of the Rocks, and it hangs in London's National Gallery. Researchers recently uncovered an early composition of the painting hidden under the treasured masterpiece. Leonardo da Vinci finished The Virgin of the Rocks in the early 1500s. It hasn't been seen like this for centuries. It's part of a new exhibit opening tomorrow at London's National Gallery. Curators recreated the setting for which it was originally intended, a church in Milan, which is now destroyed.
This was the first important commission he received in Milan in 1483. It was to paint a panel of the Virgin of the Immaculate Conception for this altarpiece in this chapel in San Francesco Grande. The first version he made of the painting was not accepted by the commissioners for reasons that are still completely unclear, and that's the painting that's now in the Louvre Museum in Paris.
Choirs sing and projections recreate the altarpiece. Leonardo Experience a Masterpiece leads visitors through the mind of Da Vinci, exploring how he created the painting.
The idea is to use immersive experience and to use digital technology to explore this great masterpiece on the occasion of the 500th anniversary of Leonardo's death in 1519.
Da Vinci worked on the painting around 25 years. It's been in the National Gallery's collection since 1880. High-tech mapping and imaging revealed a different composition the artist began before abandoning it for the version you see today. This follows earlier discoveries in 2005 showing the Virgin's pose had been changed. Researchers say there were also big changes to the designs for the angel and the Christ child.
But it's tremendously exciting that 500 years after this work was made, after many centuries of being studied, that we can still find new things.
Many consider Leonardo da Vinci the ultimate Renaissance genius, combining the roles of artist, scientist, and inventor. His paintings include the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper. He's thought to have only completed about 20 paintings. This exhibit, Leonardo Experience a Masterpiece, opens tomorrow. It'll run until January 12th, 2020. You can check it out at the National Gallery in London. All of us here at EWTN News Nightly, thank you for watching tonight. We'll be back Monday with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night and God bless.